Welcome to the Podkey summary of Apple Intelligence Group Lab from WWDC 2026. This round of Apple developer updates is really about one big shift. Apps are being wired much more directly into Siri, Spotlight, and Apple's new foundation models. The headline pieces are app schemas, app shortcuts, richer model tools like image input and evaluations, and a private cloud model option that gives developers more room without making them bolt on a whole separate AI stack. And underneath all of that, there's a lot of practical stuff about context windows, throttling, privacy, and how to make these features actually behave in the real world. The most important app-side change is probably app schemas. Developers can choose from predefined schemas like timer, calendar, or system.search, depending on what their app actually does, and they can combine those with custom app intents for anything the built-in schema doesn't cover. That mix and match part matters because the schemas aren't exclusive. One app can pull from multiple domains and create a more complete Siri experience without duplicating a bunch of code. And if a developer wants Siri AI integration, adopting a schema isn't optional. It's the requirement that gives Siri enough structure to understand the app's content and actions. That also unlocks deep linking through things like system, search, and system.open. So a user can ask Siri to search inside an app or open a specific entity directly from Siri or Spotlight. There's also a useful distinction here between app schemas and the index entity API. Schemas define the shape of the content. So if you've got books, recipes, workouts, whatever, the schema tells the system what properties those things have. Index entity is what actually pushes that content into the system's semantic index so Siri and Spotlight can retrieve it. Use them together, and Apple handles a lot of the heavy lifting. The schema gives the structure, the index gives you retrieval and deep linking. And developers don't have to manually wire up endless key-value mappings like it's still 2014. App Shortcuts sits right next to that. With App Shortcuts, developers can assign memorable phrases to specific app intent actions, which makes those actions available through Siri, Shortcuts, Spotlight, and even iPad interactions like Apple Pencil taps. The trade-off is that App Shortcuts needs a developer-provided phrase, unlike more generic app intents. But the upside is less work in other places, because Apple supplies sample phrases and training support when a schema is involved. So it's a little more explicit up front, and potentially smoother for users later. What all this infrastructure is really aiming at is a more natural Siri. Apps can now participate in multi-turn conversations, which means users can ask a follow-up question about something inside the app and not have to restate everything from scratch. The underlying language model handles the natural language parsing and intent disambiguation, so people can phrase requests more flexibly instead of memorizing one exact command. That sounds small until you picture how people actually talk. Nobody enjoys speaking to software like they're filing a tax form. On the model side, Apple's Foundation Models framework is getting more capable too. It now supports image input for both on-device models and the server-based private cloud compute model, or PCC. The protocol is also extensible, so developers can define custom modalities through a segment API, including things like video if they need it. There are still budget limits, of course. On-device models keep a 4K context window, while PCC goes up to 32K. And image inputs usually cost around 200 tokens out of that budget. So yes, it's multimodal, but it's still very much a pack-light situation. Private cloud compute is one of the cleaner developer stories here. Apple is offering access to a server model with basically a one-line call, which means developers don't have to manage API keys or stitch together a separate cloud AI service. That model runs in Apple's secure cloud and gives higher capacity, including that 32K context window, while still fitting into Apple's privacy model. So if on-device is too tight for the job, there's now a bigger option that doesn't feel like stepping off the platform. Once these systems can actually hold a conversation, context management becomes a real design problem. Developers can define dynamic profiles to switch context inside the same session, like moving between accounting and health data without dragging the wrong history along for the ride. There are modifiers like history, transform to decide what gets pruned or retained, plus utility APIs for summarization and transcript compaction. That helps apps stay within the 4K or 32K token limits and keep the conversation useful, instead of slowly filling up with stale semantic clutter. Another practical piece is the transferable API. It supports bidirectional data sharing between apps, but in a controlled way. Developers explicitly choose what can be exported and imported, which keeps the privacy boundary clear. It also works in app group scenarios and supports transformations between entity types, like converting a file entity into a photo entity through a defined pathway. That makes cross-app interactions more useful without turning them into a free-for-all. For teams building on these models, Apple is also pushing harder on evaluation. The evaluations framework includes a tool called Evaluator that checks whether the expected tools were invoked in the right order with the right parameters based on the transcript. It can also score against safety rubrics, like a 1 to 4 scale, and it works for both product development and academic research. Results can be exported as JSON too, which is not glamorous, but it is exactly the sort of thing that makes a framework usable once the demo slides are over. And finally, the less flashy but very important reality check. These models are still running inside system constraints. If a foundation model is running in the background and the device is under load, the system may throttle requests. Developers are expected to catch rate limit errors and retry later. Apple is exposing specific error codes too, including system busy, thermal pressure, and quota exhaustion. PCC models also report quota usage signals, so apps can handle that proactively instead of just face-planting when they hit the wall. Which is good. Smart assistants feel a lot less smart when they fail silently. The big picture here is pretty coherent. Apple wants apps, Siri, and its model layer to feel like one system instead of separate islands. A lot of this is developer plumbing, sure, but it's the kind that changes how software feels for everybody else. And for once, the plumbing is kind of the interesting part. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.